It's 2:01. Let's get going. Thank you for joining us for our 8th webinar on the series Navigating COVID-19, Building a Comprehensive Project Continuity Plan. Today's webinar is presented together with KPMG in Canada. My name is Kenny Leon with the Canadian Construction Association. Before we begin, just one webinar etiquette that we ask you to do. For questions, please use the questions box in your GoToWebinar panel. You can ask them right throughout the presentation, and we will answer them at the end of the session at the Q&A. But don't hesitate to ask them. You can still type the questions out, and we will actually answer them as to our best at the end. Needless to say, with construction opening up in many provinces, including just now Ontario announced as well of opening up of all construction sites, it's essential to have a solid project continuity plan. Some projects have been delayed, some projects have been pushed back. So on the webinar today to discuss these and other issues, we are delighted to have as our panelists Augusto, Patmore Partner Advisory, Global Infrastructure, KPMG in Canada, Jordan Thomson, Senior Manager Advisory, Global Infrastructure, KPMG in Canada, and also Lindsay Wright, Senior Manager, Global Infrastructure. Over to you, Jordan, Augusto, and Lindsay.
Thank you very much, Kenny. It's my pleasure to be introducing the webcast here today. As this industry works through a lot of uncertainty in the last few months, we wanted to share some thoughts, ideas, and risks, and really what we believe to be some significant opportunities facing the construction industry in the months and years to come as we work through the pandemic and post-pandemic situation. So thank you very much for attending the webinar, and I'll start with some introductions. My name is Augusto Patmore. I'm a professional engineer. I work as a partner with KPMG in Canada for the last 7 years. Prior to that, I spent 17 years in the construction industry working for several major contractors around the world, including companies like that you might have heard of, like Ferrovial from Spain, and a specialist tunneling contractor as well. Our advisory practice at KPMG provides expertise, best practices, thought leadership, and consulting services to clients across the infrastructure sector, including infrastructure agencies, private contractors, and all kinds of industry associations involved in shaping the industry and the future of the industry. So with that, I'll hand it over to Jordan and Lindsay for a brief introduction.
Yep. Good afternoon, everyone. So my name is Jordan Thomson. As mentioned, I'm a senior manager here in Toronto with the Global Infrastructure Practice. Similar to Augusto, my background is engineering. I'm a professional engineer, worked for Aecon and for Golder Associates as a design engineer, focusing mostly on oil and gas and mining kind of works. Since joining KPMG, my role is focused mostly around major project advisory, working with big projects on understanding their risks and helping them work through claims and disputes and resolve their issues.
So hi everybody, my name is Lindsay Wright. I'm a senior manager based in Toronto with KPMG Global Infrastructure. Unlike Jordan and Augusto, I started my career with KPMG, and for over 11 years I've been advising on the financial and commercial structuring of very large infrastructure projects, primarily PPPs, and most recently I've been focusing on the transportation sector, so many of them mega projects, which is always an exciting place to be in Canada.
Thank you, guys. I guess I'll turn the image off just to make it easier for me to see the screen here. And we'll run quickly through the agenda for today. We have a section where we will be discussing COVID-19 related impacts to key areas in construction, such as labor and staff on major projects and construction projects, supply chain impacts, and financing impacts as well. That is the first section of the agenda. The second section of the agenda will be more focused on understanding and looking at the future. As we work and transition into the post-COVID situation, what are the key areas to focus on, methods for contractual relief for claims, any delay claims or any dispute or contractual issues that may arise or be caused by COVID, high risk areas to monitor and pay attention to as we transition out of COVID and adapting to new ways of working, such as remote working and the use of technologies in an increasing way for all stakeholders involved in the industry. So with that, I'll just ask Jordan to turn to the next slide and start the webinar. The construction industry has really weathered the storm well so far. I was a part of the industry. We watch the industry. We work with clients across the industry. It is a really strong and resilient industry. There's no question that the smaller players in the industry are facing some increased difficulty, including some facing some cash constraints and liquidity problems. But we are certain that you know, the lenders and the banks are working with many of our clients to extend their credit facilities and allow them to move swiftly through the crisis and maintain their employees and maintain their levels of crafts and trades on site to be able to come back to normal, hopefully as soon as possible. So generally speaking, we're not seeing a huge downturn in the industry. We're not seeing a big downturn at all at this point. On the transit side, on the major project side for LRTs, P3 projects, and the Infrastructure Ontario and BC partnerships pipeline, most projects are essential. They're considered essential under the law, and the governments have decided to continue working on these projects. So life goes on, business goes on with some increasing, obviously, health and safety measures, and a lot of precaution and more focus on risk management and schedule management than ever before. It's important for owners and contractors to really take a holistic view of these projects and assess the risks going forward in order to develop a strong project continuity plan for any challenges ahead, and we'd like to talk about that a little bit. But before we do that, I'll just turn to some data that we've collected. When you look at the slide on the screen, on the left you will see the impact on construction activities in the Ontario construction sector. In the middle you will see the impact on the supply chain, and on the left is the recovery time. When you think about construction activities, 33% of construction activities have been impacted by COVID in a major way, and then a further 35% have shown moderate impacts. When you look at supply chain impacts, pretty much the same outlook. Some supply chain players, some manufacturers, material suppliers, vendors, subcontractors, equipment suppliers have shown concern, and some of them have even closed their facilities for a number of weeks through COVID. But it's not more than 1/3 of the overall population of manufacturers that have shown these signs of distress and have had to shut down their business. For the most part, when you think of concrete, the main commodities, concrete, steel, piping, cables, major equipment like transformers, most of our clients, most of the partners in the industry are maintaining their levels of operation intact. In terms of recovery time, there is a bit more of an impact. Lots of projects have seen an impact of either 1 to 3 to 6 months in their schedules, and this is just essentially caused as because we are seeing a decrease in worker attendance to some sites as management starts to work remotely. There is perhaps less direct supervision in the field, and there's a lot of COVID-related management decisions that need to be made by companies, and perhaps this has diverted the focus on some construction projects to more management functions versus ensuring sustainment of the schedule and progression of the project itself. So there are some delays, and we'll talk about ways to mitigate those delays, allow for the cost of those delays in the budget, and obviously ensure that we have a claims framework and a contractual argument to seek compensation and recovery for those delays. The top concerns right now, as I said before, really is health and safety, watching the global economics and the global recession happen. Workforce productivity is a concern, some supply chain disruptions, and then obviously top of mind is ensuring that contractors continue to meet their contractual obligations, which are already sometimes very aggressive and tight, under the contracts through the middle of this pandemic. We looked at the U.S. construction industry just as a matter of comparing with the Canadian industry, and we pretty much saw the same signs of, you know, one third of the overall population of construction projects was closed for public safety. A lot of that, about half of that, happened in the northeastern states of the U.S. A lot of other sites were closed in California. 22% of sites are having issues with getting material and equipment to site. 20% worker availability. 20% of sites had worker availability issues due to social distancing and personal issues as well. So again, you know, less craft, less trades on site, causing some disruption and delays. But really, when you look at the overall picture, this could have been a lot worse. The construction owners and construction contractors are really doing their best and working forward and coming up with solutions with their clients that will allow them to maintain project continuity. One of the most important areas of concern, and I'm sure that most people on the webinar would be fully aware, is the revised health and safety guidelines issued by both the government of British Columbia and the government of Ontario, where the new guidance is being implemented in various sites, all of the sites across the province, mostly on the major projects, but gradually getting into all types of projects, real estate included, with guidelines such as having no more than 50 people in the same space, maintaining you know, the 2-meter distance from each other, signage limiting the number of occupants in the elevators. We've been hearing about 4 people maximum in an elevator at a time. No more than 10 people in meetings and site meetings. So new rules for, you know, project meetings, site meetings, executive committee meetings on projects. Hand washing stations being installed across the project sites. If maintaining a list of employees and trades was always very important from a safety perspective, now it's ever more important to maintain that list and update it daily. And then washing and cleaning all surfaces, washrooms, shared offices, tables, desks, light switches even, and door handles every day at the end of the day, which will without a doubt, you know, cause some additional staff and additional vendors and costs being incurred on some of these projects to meet these guidelines. So there is an impact. The impact is, you know, there is a change in the guidelines and the regulations that apply to both provinces, and many contractors and owners as well are thinking of what that means in terms of, you know, cost implications and commercial consequences of these measures, which need to be recorded and need to be calculated. And we'll talk about that. Jordan is going to go through that as well. The impact on different sites varies. It depends on the conditions of the site and the location. For local sites, we've talked to some of our partners and clients, you know, and the larger companies, the larger construction companies in Ontario, for example, they're talking about labor availability declines of around 10 and 20% in that range. Some people don't come to work. They're scared. They're afraid of getting infected. They're afraid of an outbreak. But most people, for the most part, 80 to 90% are still continue to attend work and be at the work front every morning to perform their duties and their tasks. Subcontractors are limiting crew sizes. We're seeing, you know, smaller crew sizes in a lot of specialty subcontractors, particularly the ones that deal with formwork and concrete and steel fixing, which are by nature, you know, disciplines that require proximity between the people that are doing that. So we're seeing a lot of subcontractors actually being very proactive to limit the amount of you know, physical contact and proximity between the workers. And then just simply with children off school, some workers are choosing to stay home. All these issues are much worse in a remote site location. We also work, you know, for oil and gas and mining clients and energy clients up north, and there have been some outbreaks. The health and safety is critical in these remote areas, and the health facilities that are available to some of these projects is limited. So working in a camp is very different Some of the projects, like the Lower Churchill project as an example, has been put on hold, but there are many examples of mining projects being put on hold and suspended temporarily, causing obviously significant delays, significant impact on the completion dates, and employment consequences with the unions and renegotiation of terms with the unions as well, thinking about how to remobilize and what the new world will look like. From an owner's perspective, we're seeing owners that are having difficulties with their, transitioning into remote working, impacting decision-making times, design approvals, permits. There's a backlog in the permitting space. Most of you would know that already. There are a lot of permits that are holding up some construction projects, and engineering and design teams are, generally better equipped. The private sector is generally a little bit better equipped for remote working, but keep in mind that some of the owners are not as equipped. And as we go forward, we need to be together. We need to work together with our clients and the owners of our projects to make sure that we also, as contractors and advisors and players in the industry, provide everyone with adequate support and be very patient as we move through the new normal. Those are my remarks for now, and I was going to hand it over to my colleague Jordan Thomson, who is going to get more into detail on some other topics that are affecting the industry.
Yeah, great, thanks, Augusto. So yeah, so the next little section here is on the supply chain. So generally, all in all, we've seen that the general supply chain has held together pretty well. It's remained intact throughout the pandemic. Although we have been hearing from our clients that there are issues, more so on the delays and just difficulties in getting things actually to site. So a couple of key areas here. Manufacturing sector, so actually goods that are built, and a lot of them built by hand. Obviously those sites have been affected as well. Those kind of factories have been affected. So that then slows the ability to get stuff on site. So in particular, we're looking at finished goods. So where you have a lot of human involvement. In particular, we're hearing about light fixtures and hardware, things where people need to actually put these things together. Those have been slowed quite considerably. Looking abroad, we know the Canadian borders have remained open, and this has been generally the trend that we've looked at across most countries. However, there are restrictions across the world, and different priorities being put in place. So we were hearing about delays of shipments that are coming from the rest of the world. This is particularly impactful on long lead equipment. So things like your switch gear or some major pumps or things like that often come from other parts of the world. Those things can take a long time to get here when the logistics trade, which we'll talk about next, has been impacted. So on the logistics, overall, what we're hearing is trucking. It has actually been pretty good. I remember when this started up, we heard a lot about truckers not being able to find places to eat and sleep, but generally they seem to have persevered. Where the issues are coming from is nautical shipping, as well as air shipping. Those have been considerably delayed. So the big thing here is if you need a specialty part brought overnight from Germany, that could be very problematic and potentially very expensive. So the big key thing we want to kind of highlight here is wherever possible, you should be engaging with your supply chain to see how we can get things on site as soon as possible. Even if that means warehousing things or storing things on site until the point that you need them. This can help us mitigate the risk of delays going forward. Any impacts that could have to your critical path where you face the risk of not having things on site to continue the work. So turning back to the Canadian construction pricing here, this is a analysis done by Stats Canada on a quarterly basis. So this is the Q1 2020 construction index, which measures the price of construction goods and projects overall for the country. So caveat here being that this is just for the first quarter, and we only were impacted in the last few weeks of March. So we're not going to see a huge downturn here, but generally we're seeing that prices grew around 0.5, 0.6% overall for the quarter, which is in line with CPI anyway. So the key takeaway is we're not seeing a drastic impact at near the end of the quarter that would have dragged prices down. And also there's that the industry as a whole is in general good health. Prices are going in line with CPI. So, it should be in a good position to respond following, as we get back to our new normal going forward. So I'm a structural engineer, so when I think about projects, I think about steel and I think about concrete. So I thought we'd have a look at the price of steel and the price of concrete and how that might be impacting projects. So on the steel side, I like this comment here that we found saying that the global economic outlook for steel is highly unpredictable, but we generally expect to see growth in line with previous trends at about 1.7%. This, it seems like a bit of a wishy-washy statement, and it's kind of general to what we found is that most experts are seeing that we expect trends to continue the way they have been previously. Everything seems to be okay, but they leave themselves a little bit of a caveat in case things go crazy. But generally, and I think what we'll show in the next few slides is that things are generally okay. So what we're seeing here with steel prices, from analysis done by IHS Markit, which is a rather reputable industry forecaster. Their thoughts here is that COVID-19 is going to impact both your supply side and your demand side. It's going to impact the capability of mills to produce steel, but it's also going to impact manufacturing and construction that consume steel. So prices should generally hang in the balance. We've seen historically over the last year, prices have fallen. Looking back to a high about in January 2020, they've fallen about $70 to $80 per ton. And as we look forward, basically we were saying probably going to dip in the next little bit over the next quarter maybe, but then they're generally going to rebound and be pretty static going forward. So once again, there's a bit of a reaction period, but generally steel prices should be consistent and in line with what we were used to paying up until this point. Now on the concrete side, so concrete is much more of a regional good. It's it's obviously cement plants, concrete plants, all right here in Canada and local to your construction site. Under all the provincial rules, with the exception of Quebec, all of these have remained open. So they're part of the essential service of the construction industry. So they've remained open and going. The trend here we see is that over the last 10 years, ready-mix prices have been on a pretty steady increase, and they peaked about 2 years ago in January of 2018, and then have been on a decline for the last 2 years or so. But as we've surveyed around, talking to concrete vendors around Toronto area, generally we see that they're still holding true to their annual price lists, which were just issued back in January. So we see that basically concrete prices are not moving and should be in line with what we expect to see. Similarly, we should just also know that we know that a lot of construction projects will have offtake agreements taken already or established already to get concrete at a specific price, and then some have their own batch plants. So you'll be more insulated from these changes in price anyway. And lastly, the other thing, the only piece of news I think that we heard before or during the COVID pandemic is about gas prices. So this is generally not really due to COVID, although it has been exacerbated by COVID. So the initial price fall was due to overproduction from Saudi Arabia. But with the decline in vehicle use and airline use, obviously gas and oil and diesel prices in particular have remained quite low. So generally we've seen that diesel prices have fallen about 30% from their high back in January 2020. But actually, and looking forward, we expect that it's not really going to bounce back up as things get back to normal, expecting only about a 10% increase. So we expect that your diesel for your construction vehicles and equipment on site will remain cheap going forward for the foreseeable future. Now, so summing that all up, generally it would seem that construction material prices are okay, everything's moving forward all right. Where we see the risk now is the pipeline, so new projects coming in down the road. In particular, we note that a lot of the biggest projects going on in Canada right now are transit projects. And these are the industries that are been impacted probably the most, at least from an operational point of view. I'm sure you've all seen these kinds of articles in the news. TransLink out in Vancouver is losing $75 million a month. TTC is losing $18 million a week. Go ridership is down 90%. So, you know, the question that becomes in the near term, will they have funding to continue to roll out the portfolio of projects that we're used to seeing from these guys? But simultaneously, we start to ask the more existential question of, with the new ways of working that we're starting to consider, you know, things may change, but are these projects even necessary, or are these things that we want to pursue as a society going forward? So that kind of brings me into the pipeline, and I'll hand over to Lindsay as to how we actually go about financing these projects.
Sure, thanks, Jordan. So one thing that we have seen when we're talking about financing for some of these, you know, very large construction projects, particularly in the transportation space, we're seeing a lot of transit, for instance, at the moment in the multi-billion-dollar range, and they're all looking for financing. We have found that project financing is still very much available. However, it's become more expensive. We're seeing premiums on that financing increasing by kind of 0.8 to 1%. So it's effectively doubling. And that's, as far as we can tell, a direct effect of the COVID-19 crisis. We're also seeing that, you know, that might delay the pipeline, just as owners are trying to, you know, they're hoping that the market's going to settle down, maybe to come back to a bit more of what we would consider normal, or at least we did a few months ago. Although that's all going to depend on how long we think the situation is going to continue, potentially with construction, the construction market really opening up again with less restrictions. That might help soften some of the blow from that increase. But we found, you know, during the last financial crisis and kind of 2008 times, it took about a year for those risk premiums to really go back to what we would consider to be that normal level. And we expect that will be probably a similar case for this situation now. In terms of what we can do as a result of that, particularly for things like transit projects, recent federal government statement came out saying it's likely that they're really, you know, they're going to be a lender of last resort effectively, or they're going to help out as a last resort when it comes to things like transit, mainly because they see it as a provincial or municipal problem and not necessarily something for them to step into. So that's something where we will need to think about the effect that will have on that project, particularly at the provincial and municipal levels. What other funding is available? Can it be the timing be changed, or is it a case of increasing the amount of private financing in some of those deals? But the ongoing underlying issue that's always really been there, in our opinion, is just looking at the financing is not necessarily an issue. You will tend to be able to find financing for projects in Canada. It's really that funding side that is going to just become more and more of a challenge, just based on the reactions to COVID-19. Things like the tickets and tolls, raising taxes are going to be particularly hard when we're seeing the economic impacts of COVID-19 on just day-to-day life. At the end of the day, no one really wants to pay for infrastructure, although we tend to really want high-performing infrastructure at the same time. So just thinking about some of these financing considerations going forward, we're seeing a lot of projects are considering things like force majeure, or at least interrupting slowdown of schedule. So what are those considerations that we need to think about? So it may be that we had to mitigate the effects on budget. Often lenders have rights for approval to changes in budget and spending. It's going to be a case of talking to some of these lenders, looking at getting waivers, releasing from obligations, or more time to meet some of those obligations, just based on the delay to projects. Lenders could also withhold some of that financing. This can obviously lead to default, funding shortfalls, delays in construction, which is just going to exacerbate the current situation that we're also seeing. And another consideration that we really need to think about are just the financial covenants attached to some of that financing that's been provided. You know, if we're starting to see project companies having liquidity issues, and that could mean it breaches its covenants, that could definitely have some longer term implications on the overall health of many projects in the pipeline. So I'll pass over to Jordan, who's just going to talk about some of the remedies available for relief.
Beautiful. Thanks, Lindsay. So yeah, as we now move into the kind of the contingency and continuation planning here, a lot of questions that we're getting from our clients are, what is it we can do? What relief is available? And as I glanced through the questions while Lindsay was talking there, and I see that that's a theme here. So under your standard contracts, and I'll take a minute to just caveat here that this is general, our understanding. You should always consult your particular contract when we get into these kinds of things, and speak with your legal counsel about the remedies that are available to you. But generally speaking, under most contracts here in Canada, there's two avenues for relief. There's force majeure, which everyone knows about. So this is your standard act of God thing where neither party is held responsible for something. This is a tornado, blizzard, lightning strike kind of thing. However, the problem here is that it only provides you an extension of time. Neither party is financially on the hook for either person. You're responsible for your own costs, but you will be given relief under the schedule, so no liquidated damages. So that's one avenue. And I think everyone can agree this, epidemics typically fall under this kind of thing. The other avenue is change in law. So in a change in law, where the government has altered the laws or put restrictions in place, we then see typically under larger contracts, especially in the P3 realm, you get an extension of time as well as relief for your costs that you have incurred as a result of the impact. So like I said, you'll have to look at your own contracts and see how things are structured. But the conversation that we're hearing in the industry right now is really the impact is not so much from the virus, not from the epidemic itself. It's from the restrictions being put in place by the government. So there's a case to be made that the change in law could be argued, and that would provide cost relief as well as schedule. Sorry. So as I mentioned, we do a lot of this kind of claims work. So it's worth looking at what kind of areas you should be looking at on your project site to see where you have been impacted. So typical cost and schedule impact drivers that we like to look at, especially in these kinds of conditions, looking at your reductions in productivity. You want to compare your historic daily output per person against the output that you've been able to achieve during the COVID-19 pandemic. You also want to look at standby time and unproductive time. As we mentioned, your supply chain might have issues that results in things being late arriving on site. So we have to send guys home. Maybe they were working with half the materials they expected to be working with, so they weren't as productive. So things like that. Additional PPE is something we're hearing about as well. Obviously, construction sites are dangerous places, and we have lots of PPE already, but there's new kinds of PPE that maybe need to be brought on site and has additional costs associated with it, as well as the training that goes along with that. Inefficiencies from resequencing. Obviously, if you need to change your schedule around to have crews further apart from each other so they're not all in the same space at the same time, that can have impacts on your critical path as well as just your productivity. As Augusto mentioned, staff and labor absenteeism, people who aren't available to come to work or don't want to come to work. Delayed decision making is something that we've heard a bit about as well. As we mentioned, owners aren't necessarily as equipped for remote working as others, so that can delay decision making and then hold up things on site. Knock-on delays from weather-sensitive activities being pushed in the next year. I think this is going to be a big one. We have lost some pretty prime months, and we're probably going to lose a couple more realistically, just from, even though we're opening things back up now, we're not going to be as productive going forward through the summer months. This means you might have some work being pushed into winter, and maybe that's not feasible. So that's something to keep in mind. And then last 2 points here, demob and remob, especially in Quebec and some of the smaller projects around the rest of Canada where they've been forced to shut down. These are definitely things we need to consider. And lastly, financing. As Lindsay mentioned, there's obviously a financing cost for all these projects that can be borne by contractors in some cases. So if the project gets longer or is delayed, obviously there could be additional financing costs being borne by the project. So adapting to the new normal. I know a lot of, like we said, a lot of projects have been able to continue, a lot of projects got shut down. But as we try to adapt to our new normal or new ways of working, there's a few things we'll need to keep in mind. So the first thing here is conducting a COVID-19 government guidance check. So thinking about making sure that we're in line with all the guidelines that seem to be changing on a daily basis as to how we work, as safe as possible in this new reality. Something we want to mention here is, the Green Book is still law, and a lot of the things that come out are guidelines. There may come a day when these things get integrated into the Green Book or whatever your equivalent health and safety guidance is in your respective provinces. So we need to keep an eye on when those things actually do become legally enforceable. So once that gets rolled out, and we know what our guidance is, that's when we roll out the training and making sure that everyone on site knows what the situation is, knows what the guidance is around how we work and how we stay safe, and especially making sure that our health and safety specialists are up to speed on that. The other half of that is going to be then understanding the risk on the project and understanding what the impacts are going to be going forward. So this involves having a real transparent conversation with owners and other stakeholders around what the impacts might be going forward. Looking at your supply chain, any logistical constraints, contractual risks, and other regulatory constraints that you have that are going to impact your ability to deliver the project. And then finally, we want to reach out and assess the impacts that the pandemic has had on your vendors and your subcontractors. Are they still able to deliver their contractual obligations to you? And then how does that impact your contractual obligations to your owner or your prime? In particular, this is important because maybe you need to go out and find a different contractor or a different supplier that will be able to get you things on time. So the last thing we want to talk about is rebaselining. And I think this is probably the most important piece of advice that we're giving to all of our clients right now is rebaseline your project. So I think I saw a question in the feed saying, asking about how do we deal with concurrent issues and other delays that may have happened prior, is you need to cut it off right at the point. You need to figure out how delayed you were, what your budget or cost implications were right up to the point of the impacts or when you were shut down or when you started to see issues on site, and rebaseline to that point so that any conversations going forward you can isolate and you can have a clear conversation on what exactly was related to COVID and what was everything else. Now, what you can do there is something called a quantitative risk assessment to be able to take a risk-based look at what your forecast looks like and what the impact COVID-related risks might have on your schedule, what kind of impact they might have on your costs. So this might be done through Monte Carlo modeling, but it should be done, in consultation with everyone again, having a real transparent conversation with all the stakeholders from the project. And the last thing we want to kind of highlight is having a shutdown plan. And I know it seems like we're just getting over the shutdown now, but having a pragmatic point of view here, there's a high risk that we could be impacted again, especially as we look ahead to fall and winter of 2021. It could be happening again, and we could be forced to socially isolate again, and that would have its own impacts on projects. So it's important that you have a contingency plan in place to be able to efficiently manage that and keep as much work going on as possible in a socially isolated workplace. So with that, I'll turn back to Augusto to kind of close this up here.
Thank you, Jordan, and I'm hoping we can give everybody some time back in, I'm sure, what is a busy afternoon. And I just wanted to wrap it up by walking through a few ideas. First of all, we'd love to hear from all of you, or as many of you as we can directly. We provided our contact information, and you could email us, or you could reach out or call us if you have any questions. We are willing to share other thought leadership and materials. We produce materials and presentations and decks for the industry on a regular basis. We publish articles on the various topics that are affecting the industry. So feel free to reach out, and we'll provide copies and send you materials as you might need or you might find interesting. in terms of companies or clients that would want a bit more of an in-depth analysis in their particular situation, we can also help. We have developed a framework. It's a very detailed framework. We have divided our framework into what we call assessment areas. The target of the framework is to help decide companies draft a project continuity plan. We call the framework the Quantitative Risk Assessment, and essentially what it is like Jordan mentioned before, gathering all the data and information, interviewing your project team and your stakeholders, including your project management team, to assess the impacts on the cost and the schedule and the new risks that have been introduced on each of your projects or your portfolio overall. And this assessment will typically allow you to make informed decisions in these uncertain times. So we go step by step. We look at resource availability. We determine whether you've suffered any impacts in that area. We look at your supply chain, look at your various contractors. Work with you to identify potential impacts that may be hidden or may have not come up yet, but they will come up in the future, in the short-term future. Look at your material supply chain as well. Look at your equipment providers. Productivity, many of you will have productivity tracking and productivity data for your sites. Some other companies don't do this regularly, so we can help either perfect the data and refine it, or produce the data from scratch. If there's any other health and safety related implications or other government or regulatory constraints that your projects are facing, we will capture those as well in our assessment. And finally, as we are seeing in some of the projects, some subcontractors are showing signs of distress and cash liquidity issues. We'll identify those issues and work towards finding a plan B for you to be able to have always, the part of the strength in the continuity is to have a plan B for everything. You should have a plan B for your key supplies, but also a plan B for each of the key disciplines and trades involved in your project. So identifying those plan B contractors and suppliers will be critical. All of that allows us to capture, those impacts into a project schedule delay analysis. We list, the delay events, impact the schedule, and then work with you to determine which of the delays are concurrent, which of the delays are critical, and what the impact is to substantial completion or total completion on your project. On that basis, you may want to look at further support in the area of construction claims, support helping you build the argument so that you can have a fruitful and positive negotiation with your client and bring the facts and the evidence before your client. And I always argue for a strong negotiation and a successful negotiation can only happen when there are many facts and data on the table. And so we can help with gathering those facts and the data and produce the evidence that you need to talk to your clients and request additional compensation where you feel there may be entitlement. As Jordan pointed out, the involvement of your legal counsel as you assess many of these risks is paramount, is very critical, and we are always here to work with your legal counsel or even through your legal counsel as well in these areas. I won't go into more detail on the key process steps. They're on the slides, and I'm sure that Kenny will share the materials after the webinar. But I think we reached our time, and we have about 10 minutes or so for some questions. Oh, before I forget, there are some other resources that we've provided here as part of the webinar. Infrastructure and COVID by our global head of infrastructure is an interesting article with more of the economic impacts on the industry overall and the infrastructure industry overall, not just construction, but also in terms of tax planning and transit agency economic trends, things of that nature. And then Jordan, who's on the webinar today, has recently published an interesting article describing the impacts of the pandemic on the Canadian construction industry, and that is available as well. The other links are government resource links that most of you would have already, but just in case we've gathered them all, and you have the links on the materials. So with that, I would be happy to continue our discussion offline or take any questions right now as we look at wrapping up this webinar. Hopefully this was useful to everyone. So open to questions.
So yeah, we've got a couple here, Augusto, in the chat. One I saw earlier that I quite like is, so what about projects that were already delayed before COVID due to the contractor and should have been completed before? Will the contractor be held responsible for the impact of COVID on the project? So if I could paraphrase that, I think we're saying that basically we have a project that's been delayed and should have been complete prior to COVID, but due to the impacts of COVID, we are now prolonged again. So it's an interesting situation. I think I'm going to caveat all these things with the same thing and say that we, obviously involved as to how your contract is worded. It becomes a bit of a logic game as to whose responsibility that is. I would suggest that the force majeure event is like COVID is it happens, and if it happens, that would result in the prolong. It's no one's fault, and therefore they should be at minimum. I would imagine they would be granted an extension of time. I know what your thoughts there, Augusto, would be.
I think you're right, Jordan. I think this is where the detailed analysis becomes more important, because if a project has incurred significant delays before, there has to be a cutoff date and there's not a clear cutoff date, unfortunately, as of when COVID started impacting the project. This has been a gradual process as we have seen the impact grow over time. But detailed analysis of the schedule, looking at those delay events and those impacts that occurred, say, back in December, November, or prior to that, in 2019. Any of the impacts that happened in February, March, April timeframe are potentially more closer and could be correlated with COVID. At the end of the day, like Jordan said, it's a judgment call. Interviewing the key stakeholders, being truthful and realistic. Okay, that's very important. Being truthful and realistic. Last thing you want to do in a claims negotiation is inflate your arguments and try to take advantage and see this as an opportunity to get compensated for issues that really have nothing to do with COVID. But focus on building the arguments for in the cases for those delay events that clearly happened through COVID and where you saw labor absenteeism, productivity declines, supply chain disruption and delays in equipment arriving to site, or just in implementing the additional health and safety measures that we all talked about. So those are my comments with that. But the detailed analysis is very important. There's not a black and white answer. Every case, every project is different. So we'd have to look at the contract and we'd have to interview your teams, and we can certainly help with that.
Yeah, so Nicole, the person who asked that question, I'm very happy to speak afterward if that's at all useful. One other question we have, another question we have here is, will the owners be responsible for implementing these procedures and health and safety procedures that the contractor has to implement? How is the responsibility shared with the contractor?
I may take a stab at that, Jordan, if you want me to.
Yeah, go for it.
It'll depend case by case. Private owners on major industrial projects are willing to have some skin in the game. These owners always sometimes act as part owner, part contractor. In many cases, there's an integrated team between the owner and the contractor. In those cases, both owners and contractors are working together as one team, and so I'd say the risk is shared. And so there'd be a lot more collaboration and agreement as to who bears what cost. On the government or public side of the business, on the transit, transportation projects, and social buildings, my sense is that the contractors will bear the brunt. And again, there are areas where you could seek compensation, and there are areas where you could build your arguments to make the case that when the bid was prepared and when the bid was put forward in the tender process, none of these regulations were in place. So does the change in law apply? That's something that you would have to consult your legal counsel on. But I unfortunately on the traditional side of the business, I feel that the contractors are going to be asked and are being asked to take those measures at their own cost and risk right now. And in some cases, that is not entirely reasonable and is not entirely fair. And so there may be contractual recovery mechanisms and opportunities there.
So one other question we have here. So how big of an, this one's good for you, Lindsay. How big of an impact do you think the increase in project financing rates will have on the project pipeline going forward?
Sure. So I mean, I'm thinking that the financing rates and the increases there, I mean, it'll have an impact, most likely on either the slowdown of kind of project timetables, maybe just taking a bit of time to organize their financing or rethink that funding financing kind of sweet spot on every project. And it might also mean that, you know, we have to look at getting additional funding from other parts of government, say, to help make up some of that difference through that upcoming stimulus spending that is planned. To be honest, I think more than anything else than the financing rates having an impact, I'd also just expect it to potentially have this whole situation to have an impact on the pipeline in terms of thinking what should that pipeline be, and really thinking about, you know, do we want to do another transit project? Are we just going to see more people work from home, and therefore that might change the kind of impact that a transit project would have? Do we need to look more at healthcare from a different perspective? So I think it'll have more of an effect on just thinking about what that future pipeline is, and then also the resiliency of that pipeline itself, and the projects themselves, and make sure that they are capable of dealing with another COVID-19, whether that's you know, next year or future years.
Great. Oh, there's one more question. Yeah, we'll do one more here. What should project be focusing for? What should projects be focusing on for their continuity plan at this point when things are starting to open up? So, Augusto, I'll defer to you in a second. But so I think we had talked about is rebaselining, is rebaselining your project, drawing a line in the sand at, you know, where we start to see the impacts of COVID versus where all the impacts you had up until that point, so that you can have a very clear and transparent conversation with the other stakeholders as to what has happened and how you're being impacted, and so that you can then quantify that and be able to be relieved for some of those costs. Augusto, I don't know what your thoughts are there.
I think it's back to my earlier point. I think it's a very good question. Looking at what the delay events were in February, March, and April, looking what the productivity was like and the trend in productivity in February, March, and April, looking at your worker attendance in those 3 months, February, March, and April, that will allow you to build a good story line to explain to your owner what has happened in those 3 months that was out of your control as a contractor. I think it's about going back into those documents, going back into your document control section of your project and the records, and building that storyline, so that, because the risk is you focus on the opening, now we're back to normal, and now your client is saying, well, there's no reason for claims, you guys only, you know, there's only a few weeks of a small hiccup. But I think bringing the arguments forward, it's more than just a hiccup. There's been a few months of turmoil, and we're all feeling it, and we've felt it, and we must record what happened. If anything else, Jordan, I think you and I have seen in many cases where there's a global settlement at the end of the contract, where a retroactive schedule delay analysis is performed to you know, include all of the delay impacts throughout the project from the outset. So those records will be critical at that time. If the strategy is to continue working and then any claims will be reserved until the end, then it becomes critical to make sure that now, when your memory is fresh, you are capturing that data for the last few months.
Yeah, no, that's well said. That's a good point.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, I think that's it for questions. Yeah, I think that's it for questions. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, that's pretty much in terms of all the questions that we had. For those of you who asked whether we will be sending the deck, yes, we will be actually forwarding the deck and the recording of this presentation as well. So you would have a copy of both the recording and the deck as well. Plus also, of course, the links that was mentioned where Augusto mentioned in terms of that's appearing on your screen right now. Thank you once again to Augusto, Jordan, and Lindsay for your expert and very valuable insight. Surely there's going to be more questions as things open up in terms from from project perspective. As I mentioned earlier, Ontario announced opening up of all the all sorts of construction beginning Monday. Thank you once again for joining us today for this call. We hope to see you at one of our future webinars soon. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Kenny, and thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of the day.
Thank you.